This is the final video of 8 that I'm sharing here on YouTube from my full course Vue JS 3 Composition API with Pinia and Vite. In this video we're going to be learning all about child components within a Composition API app, including how to create and import child components, slots and props, how to emit custom events with Emits, modelValue and update modelValue, dynamic components, and provide Inject. You can find a link to the whole playlist down in the description, and you can grab the full course with my discount at dannys.link/compositionapi. Let's cover child components in this module, since a lot has changed regarding child components when we use the Composition API, especially how we handle props, emits, the new modelValue and update modelValue pattern, dynamic components, and provide inject. Let's start by turning this modal into a child component. So I'm going to create a new file in the source components folder, and for some reason I don't have that folder, so I'll just create it, components, and in there I'll create a new file called model.vue, and I'll add the template tags and save that. And now let's jump to our modals view in source views and modals view.vue, and let's cut out our modal code, including the teleport component, and then paste that into our template on modal.vue. For now, I'll just remove the vif directive and this click handler on the hide modal button, since we don't have this data ref here. And I'll also cut the styles from modals view.vue. I'll cut the entire style tag and paste that into modal.vue and save that. Now let's import this modal.vue component into modals view.vue. So let's just remind ourselves how we did this with the options API. I'll add some more script tags, add the export default. And in the options API, we first had to import our component. So import modal from @components/modal.vue. And then in our default export, we had to add a components object and stick our component in there. And we would then be able to use this component in our template. And this should still work, because remember, we can combine the options API with the Composition API, although I wouldn't recommend that. So if we stick this component on the page, modal, and put that vif back in, so vif show modal, and save that, click on the button, and we can see our modal. And in the options API, this components object was always a bit of a pain in the butt, because every time we add a new child component or rename a component, we always have to keep this components object updated. But in the Composition API, we don't need to worry about that. All we need to do is import our component and we can use it. So I'll just comment out this code. Let's do this the Composition API way. And all we need to do is just import this component. So I'll just copy this import statement and we'll paste it here. And that's all we need to do. So I'll save that, reload, and we can now see our modal. And our hide modal button isn't working, but don't worry, we'll fix that later on. Before we move on, I've noticed that there's a very slight delay the first time we load the modals page and the posts page. And I don't always see it, but sometimes I do, and it's a little bit annoying. So I'm just going to fix that. So I'm going to jump to source and router and index.js. And the reason this is happening is because we're lazy loading these components. So in other words, when we load a component like this, instead of importing it beforehand and just adding it like this, then the component only gets loaded into memory at the point when we visit that route, which does result in a very slight delay when we load those components for the first time. To fix this, we can just explicitly import all of these components beforehand, just like we've done with the home view. View. So I'm just going to duplicate this line, import home view 3 times, and then I'll do a multiple selection on home view and replace that with modals view. And then on the next one, I'll do a multiple selection and replace it with posts view. And for the last one, I'll replace that with post detail view. And then I'm just going to do a multiple selection on these 3 names. by holding down the Alt key, and then I'm going to do a multiple selection down here on each of these methods, which are lazy loading those components, and just paste in those component names and save that. And we should now no longer see any delay, and all of our pages should load nice and quickly, even the first time we hit them. For the most part, slots work in exactly the same way in the composition API. So just to demonstrate that, if we jump to model.view, instead of hard coding this content into this model.view component, let's pass this down from the parent component, models view.view, using a slot. So I'm going to jump to model.view and cut this paragraph and instead just place a slot here and save that. And then in models view.view, we'll paste the paragraph in here, which I cut before. And let's save that and jump back to our modals page. Click on the button, and yeah, that content is getting through using our slot. And also named slots work in the same way as well. So I'm going to jump to model.view, and let's say we want to pass the modal title down using a named slot. I'll just remove this text and add another slot here, but we'll give this one a name of title and save that. And we should now be able to pass this title down using a named slot. So to do that, we can just add a template tag here, type in the content we want to send using this slot. So my new title, and then to our opening template tag, we need to add v-slot, colon, and then the name of our slot, and we named it title. And let's see if that's working. Yeah, we can see my new title there. And we can also shorthand this v-slot colon bit by using a hash symbol instead. So I'll save that, see if that's still working. And yeah, that's still working. So you can see this all works in exactly the same way as before with the Options API. The only thing that works differently is how we programmatically access our slots data. Now, if we want to access our slots data in the template, we can still do that in the same way as before. So after this slot here, I'm just going to add a pre-tag. And we can still access our slots data using the $slots keyword, just like we could in the Options API. So if I want to grab the data related to the title slot, I can just do $slots.title and then parentheses, save that, and we can see all of the data related to our slot being spit out. However, if we want to access this data programmatically in our script section, which is probably something that you'll rarely need to do, although I did find that I needed to do this once in my app Fudget 2 that I'm working on, then we need to do this a little bit differently in the composition API. So I'll add our script setup tags. So in the Options API, if we wanted to access this slots data, we could just do this $slots.title. But in the composition API, we need to import a composable from Vue, which is the use slots composable. So what we can do instead is import use slots from Vue, and then we can assign this composable to a constant. So const slots equals use slots parentheses, and we can then access our slots data using this slots constant. So if we wanted to get this title again, we could just do slots.title parentheses, and let's just log that out, console.log, and save that. Show the modal, and we can now see our slots data being spit out in the console. And again, this is not something you're going to need very often, but there are some rare cases when you will. And before we move on, let's just remove everything in the script section here, and let's remove this pre-tag that we've added as well. Let's look at how we handle props using the composition API. Now, the way that we pass props down from a parent component to a child component is exactly the same as before. It's only the way that we receive props in the child component from the parent component that's changed. So let's jump to models view.view, and let's say we want to pass this title down using a prop instead of using a named slot. So let's just remove this template tag here, and I'll split the attributes on this modal. And instead we'll pass this down using a prop. So we can add a prop called title and then pass in our title. So my modal title parentheses via prop, and save that. Now let's jump to model.view, and now we need to receive this prop. So in the Options API, I'll just add another script section, add the export default, So in the options API, we added a props option, and we could either set this to an array or an object, and we could place our props in here. So we could add our title prop, set that to an object, and we could set the type to string, because this is going to be a string. And if we want, we can set a default value in case the prop has not been specified on the parent component. So we could set the default to no title specified and save that. And this should still work because remember, we can combine the options API with the composition API. So I'll get rid of this slot here and instead just output double curly braces and title and save that. And let's see if we can see the title in our modal. And yeah, we can see the title there. My modal title via prop. However, we do this a bit differently using the composition API. So let's comment out this script section. And we'll do this the composition API way. So first, I'm just going to add one of these block comments, which says props. And to receive our props using the composition API, we need to create a constant called props and set that equal to a new method called define props. And one thing to note is that unlike most of the Vue methods, such as ref and reactive and computed, etc., we don't actually need to import this define props method from Vue. It's just automatically available. And now we can just define our props in the same way within these parentheses. So we can pass these in as an array like this. Or if we want to get more specific and pass in the type and the default, etc. of our props, then we can pass in an object instead. And we can define our props in the same way. So I'll just copy this title prop that we defined before and paste that in here and save that. And hopefully that should be working now. I'll just reload the page, show the modal, and yeah, we can see the prop is getting through. And let's just make sure our default value is getting through if we don't specify the prop on the parent component. So I'll jump to modals Vue.view and just remove this title prop and save it. And yeah, we can see no title specified. And I'll just undo that and put it back in and save it. And one thing to note is that when we use our props in our template, we can either just use the straight up name of the prop, like we have here, title, and we can also use props.title. Save that. And you can see that these both work. And I'll just put this back to just title. However, if we want to access our prop in our script section, then we do need to use this props constant. So if I try to console log title, then we see an error. However, if we console log props.title, then we can see the prop being logged out. And before we move on, let's just remove this console log and save that. We can't currently close this modal. So how can we get this button when we click it to close this modal? Well, this button is on modal.view. And if we jump to its parent component, modals Vue.view, we have this show modal ref, and this is determining whether the modal is shown or not. So when we click this button on the child component, we need to somehow set this show modal ref, which is on the parent component, back to false in order to hide the modal. And one way we could do this is by emitting a custom event when we click on this button and then listening out for that event on the parent component, on this modal component. And then when we receive that event, we can just set show modal back to false, thus hiding the modal. So let's jump to modal.view and we'll emit a custom event when we click this button. Now in the options API, I'll just uncomment this code for a sec. We had to add a emits option set to an array. And we had to declare our custom events here, such as hide modal. And we would then be able to emit this custom event from our template. But we declare our emits differently with the composition API. So I'll just comment this out again. And what we need to do, and I'll just add another block comment here, which says emits. And what we need to do in the composition API to declare our emits is create a constant called emit, and set that equal to a method called define emits, a bit like the define props method. And again, like the define props method, we don't need to import this method from Vue. And then we just pass an array into that where we can declare all of our custom events. So let's declare an emit called hide modal. And we can now emit this custom event, hide modal, from anywhere in our template. So we can now just jump to this button element and add a click handler, and then use the $emit method, and then just emit this custom method, hide modal. So you can see the way that we use emits in our template is exactly the same way as before. It's just the way that we declare them in our script section that's different. So if I save that, we can now listen out for this event on the parent component, modelValue. So let's jump to that. And if we jump to this modal component, we can just add @hide modal, which is the name that we used here and here. And then we can do something when we receive that event. And we just want to set show modal back to false. So we can just do show modal equals false. So let's save that and see if it's working. I'll reload the page, click on the button, and then click on the hide button, and we can see that's now working. So this is how we emit an event directly from our template. But what if we need to emit an event programmatically from our script section? Well, with the options API, we could just do this $emit and then emit the event like this. However, that's not going to work in the composition API. Instead, we need to use this emit constant. But before we do that, when we click this button, instead of emitting that event directly from the template, let's trigger a local method instead. So let's trigger a method called handle button click. And then I'll add another block comment here, handle button click, and set up that method. Let's just make sure that's triggering when we click the button. Yep, that's triggering. And so to emit our event from here, all we need to do is emit and then the name of our custom event. So hide modal. Let's save that. And this should be working now. So I'll reload, show the modal, and click on hide modal. And we see the modal disappear. Right now, when we click on this hide modal button, we trigger this handle button click method, and then in there we emit this custom event hide modal. Then on the parent component, we listen out for that custom event and then set show modal back to false. But we can actually simplify this by accessing this show modal ref directly from the child component model.view and changing it directly back to false, thus removing the need to set up custom events and then emitting those events. In the options API, we could do something like this with the sync modifier. But in the composition API, we can do this with vModel, the new modelValue prop, and the update modelValue event. First of all, let's jump back to models view.view. And instead of this vIf directive, we'll add a vModel directive, and we'll set that to this ref, show modal, so that we can give this child component access to this show modal ref. Oops, I've typed in vModal there. That should be vModel, and I'll save that. And now if we jump to model.view, we can get access to the data property that's being passed in with vModel using a special new prop called modelValue. And I usually declare this prop at the top of my props object. So I'll add that here. So we just add modelValue, and we can set the type if we like. And this is going to be a Boolean, because our show modal ref is a Boolean. So we'll set the type to Boolean, and we'll set the default to false. Let's save that. Now let's use this modelValue prop to determine whether the modal is shown instead of the vIf that we had before on the parent component. So we can just jump to this div with a class of modal and add a vIf directive and set that to vIf modelValue. So in other words, if this show modal ref is false, then it's going to get passed down with vModel as false and then received as modelValue. And so modelValue will be false, and this div with a class of modal will not be shown. However, if show modal is true, that's going to get passed down with vModel and then picked up by this modelValue prop where it will still be true, and then we'll show the modal. So let's just save that and see if it's working. I'll click on the button, and yeah, we can see the modal. So we know this prop is getting through correctly. So in order to hide this modal, we're still triggering this handle button click method when we click the button. And then we're emitting this custom event, hide modal. And then we're listening out for that event and then setting show modal back to false. But we can actually manipulate the ref that we're passing in here, show modal, directly by using the new update model value event. And this way we can get rid of this hide modal event and remove it from this component. So let's jump back to model.vue. And instead of emitting this custom event, we're going to emit a new event called update model value. And then we need to pass the value that we want to change the model value to. So we want to change it to false. And so what this is going to do is whatever value we're passing in with vModel, it's going to change it directly to whatever value we specify here. So if I save that now and show the modal and click the hide modal button, we can see the modal is hidden. Now we do see a warning in the console here, event update model value, but it is neither declared in the emits option nor as an on update model value prop. So we just need to add this event to our emits array here, like this, update model value. And this should get rid of that warning, show the modal and hide the modal, and we no longer see the warning. And since we're no longer using this hide modal event anymore, we can just remove it from this array. Save that. And if I jump back to modals view.vue, we no longer need to listen out for this hide modal event, since we're now manipulating the show modal ref directly using the update model value event. So we can just get rid of this now and save that. Now let's see if this is still working. And yeah, it's still working. And let's jump back to model.vue. And we can also emit this event update model value directly from our template as well. So instead of firing this method here, I'll just comment out this method but leave it there for reference. We can just change this click handler and use the $emit method and just simply emit update model value, and then set the value we want to set it to, which is false, and save that. And let's see if that's still working. And yeah, that's still working as well. So you can see that using model value and update model value massively simplifies our child to parent communication and often removes the need to set up custom events and then listen out for those custom events. Dynamic components allow us to switch out the component that is being used in a particular part of our app. Let's demonstrate this by creating a dark version of our modal, which we can switch out on this modals view.vue page based on a checkbox. Now, in a real-world app, if you wanted to have modals which were both light and dark, then the best thing to do would be to just have one modal component and switch out the styles using props. So what we're about to do is not exactly a best practice, but it's a nice easy way to demonstrate the concept of dynamic components. First, let's make our modal component on modals view.vue a dynamic component. So all we need to do is change this to a component and make sure both the opening and closing tags have been renamed. And then we just add an is prop, so :is, and we just set that to the component that we want to display here. And we just want to display our modal component, so we can just use the name modal. So I'll set this to modal, save that, and it should be working just like before. So I'll click on show modal, and yeah, we can still see the modal, and we can still hide it. Except now we can actually change the component that gets displayed here by simply changing this is prop programmatically. So before we create our dark version of our modal, let's just add a checkbox to the page, which we can use to toggle whether or not we show light or dark modals. So after our heading, I'm going to add a div, and then inside that, I'm going to add a label, and then inside that, I'm going to put the text show dark modals ? And then after that text, I'll add an input, set the type to checkbox. Let's save that to make sure it's looking okay. And yeah, that looks pretty decent. So now let's set up a ref which we can bind to this checkbox. So let's scroll down to our script section, and above this show modal ref, let's add a new ref called show dark modals. Set that equal to a ref with an initial value of false. And we'll use this ref to determine whether we show dark modals or light modals. So now let's bind this ref to our checkbox, which is here. So we can just set the vModel to show dark modals, save that. And just to make sure this is working, I'm going to add a pre-tag after this div and just output show dark modals and save that. And we can see it's false initially. And if we check the checkbox, it's set to true. And if we uncheck it, it's set back to false. Before we create our dark modal, let's just remove this pre-tag and save. Okay, let's create our dark modal. So let's jump to modelValue. And I'm just going to remove these comments and this one as well. And save that. And now let's duplicate this component. So I'll jump to source, components, and model.view and duplicate with the duplicate action extension. And we'll name this model dark.view. And let's change the class on this div to model-dark. Scroll down to the styles, change the class here to model-dark. And instead of a beige background, we'll set this to #333, which will be a dark gray color. And then we'll set the color, the text color, to white and save that. And just to reiterate, if you wanted to have modals which were light and dark in a real world app, then this wouldn't be the best way to do it because we're duplicating a lot of our code here. It'd be better to just have a single model.view component, which we can then pass a prop to, say a prop called dark. And then if we receive that prop, then add a different class to the modal to give it different styles. So I'm just using this as an example to demonstrate dynamic components, but not as an example of best practices. Okay, so now let's jump to modelsView.view, and we can now switch out the component that gets used in this isProp based on our show dark modals ref. So first of all, we need to import the dark modal component. So I'll duplicate this line, change that to modal dark, and change the file name here to modal dark. And what we can do in this isProp, we can use a ternary if statement here to spit out a different component based on our show dark modals ref. So we can do if show dark modals is true, then we'll use the modal dark component. Otherwise, we'll use the modal component. So let's save that. Click on the show modal button and we see the light modal. Hide that. Now I'll check the checkbox, which should set show dark modals to true. And we should see our dark modal now if we click on the button. And there we go. So now we can easily switch back and forth between our light and dark modals. We saw how to pass data from a parent component to its direct child component using props. But what if we want to pass data down to a really deeply nested child component? Well, using props, we would need to pass the data from parent to child to child to child and so on until we reach the desired child component. And this can be a very messy way to pass data around. And we can get around this problem by using provide inject. So let's jump to our root component app.view. I'm just going to close everything first and we'll go to source and app.view. And let's say we have a reactive object on this component with some data, which we want to pass all the way down to this modal component. First of all, let's just set up a reactive object on app.view. So let's add our script section, our script setup tags. And let's say we have a reactive object with some user data. So I'll add a block comment here, which says user data. And we'll set up a const called user data, set that equal to a reactive object. And we need to import reactive from Vue. So I'll add another comment which says imports, and we'll import reactive from Vue. And let's add some data to this user data reactive object. So let's say it has a name property. We'll set that to Danny, and a username property, and we'll set that to Danny Connell and save that. And let's just display this data in the top right hand corner of our page. So I'm going to jump up to the top of the template and add a div here with a class of user-data. Then I'll add double curly braces and user data.name, and then we'll output the username as well. So I'll add an @ symbol and then double curly braces, and then user data.username. Save that. And let's just add some styles to make this look a bit better. I'll scroll down to the bottom of the style section, target the user-data div, and we'll set the position to absolute, the background to beige, set the top to 0 to stick it on the top, set the right to 0 as well, so we've got it in the top right corner. I'll set the font size to 12 pixels, and we'll add a little bit of padding as well, 5 pixels, save that. Now let's say we want to pass this data down to our modal component using props. Well, first of all, we need to pass it as a prop to our router view component, like this, user data equals user data. Save that. Then we need to receive this in our modals page, source views modals view.view. So I'll just add a comment here which says props. So then we need to add a const named props, set that equal to define props, pass in the user data prop, and I'll set the type to object. And now we need to pass this user data object again down to the modal component, which is here. So we can do user data equals user data, save that. And now we need to open up the modal component and receive this prop. So we need to add the prop here. So user data, set the type to object. And we can now finally use this user data object on our modal. So I'll add a div after this button here. And in there, I'll just put username is double curly braces, user data dot username, save that, reload and show the modal, and we can see the username in the modal. So you can see that this gets messy very quickly, especially on a real world app when you might have components which are much more deeply nested than this modal component. So we saw that if we want to pass data from app.view down to modal.view, we have to pass it as a prop to our router view, then receive that prop in modal's view.view, and then pass it down as a prop again to modal.view, and then receive it in modal.view before we can actually use it. So this approach isn't much fun. So let's fix this problem using provide inject. So first, let's just remove all the changes we made here with props. So in modal.view, let's remove this div that we added, and also remove this user data prop from our props object, save that, and then jump to modal's view.view and remove this user data prop from the component, and then remove our props object, save that. Then we'll jump to app.view and remove this prop from our router view, save that, reload. And now let's use provide to make this user data reactive object available to all of app.view's child components, no matter how deeply nested they are. So first we need to import the provide method from Vue. And now after we declare this user data reactive object, we can just fire this provide method. And for the first parameter, we just need to provide a placeholder name for this data so we can access it in our child components. And we do this as a string. And I'll just give this the same name as our reactive object, user data. And then for the second parameter, we just pass the data that we want to make available, which in this case is this user data reactive object. So I'll set this second parameter to user data, save that. And now this data should now be available to all of app.view's child components. So we now don't need to do anything to modal's view.view. We can just skip right down to the grandchild component modal.view, and we can grab this data using inject. So let's jump straight down to the grandchild modal.view, and now we need to import the inject method from Vue. So I'll add a comment which says imports at the top, and we'll just import inject from Vue, and we can now use this method. So I'll jump down to the bottom of the script section, add a new comment which says user data. And all we need to do to grab this data that's being provided is fire the inject method and pass in the placeholder name as a string, which we used in our provide method, which is user data. So all we need to do is inject user data. And to make it available in this template, we just need to assign it to a constant or a variable. So we'll just assign this to a constant with the same name, user data, like that. And we can now access this data with this user data constant. So if we jump back up to the template, again, I'll add a div after this button, and I'll just put username is colon double curly braces and then user data dot username. Save that, reload, show the modal, and we can now see our username. But we've massively simplified our components by using provide inject. I hope you've enjoyed this preview from my course Vue JS 3 Composition API with Pinia and Vite, and you can grab the full course by going to dannys.link/composition API, and the link is in the description. In the rest of this course, we're going to first of all learn the basics of composables. We're going to learn how to create our own custom composables so that we can easily share functionality around our components. And then we're going to learn how to import composables from the Vue use library. After that, we're going to learn the basics of state management using Pinia, which is the new gold standard for state management for Composition API apps. And then once we're done learning all of the basics, we're going to spend the rest of the course creating this responsive app called Noteballs, which is a note-taking app from scratch. And in this app, we can view a list of notes, we can add a new note, we can edit a note, and we can delete a note as well with this modal that pops up. This app is going to put into practice everything that we've learned in the basics in a real-world example app. I'll also be showing you how to install Vue Router and Pinia completely from scratch for this app as well. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the full course.